G'day everybody and welcome to another Scott Poynton podcast. And I am delighted today to be able to welcome an author and also a practitioner of sustainability work in a very diverse way over the period of his career, and that is Tim Christophersen. And Tim has written what I think is a beautiful and inspiring book called Generation Restoration. He was very kind to send me a copy of it. I read it over Christmas and we lined up this discussion so that we can share not only what's in the book, but learn more about Tim and learn about his work with the UN and now with Salesforce to address some of the issues that he talks about in the book around restoration. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome you. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much, Scott. And I'm very happy that our agendas finally aligned and we could connect. So happy to speak a little bit about the book and discuss with somebody who knows this field very well, as you do, some of the lessons that are in it.
I was really impressed and happy to read the book because there's a lot of things in there that, I knew about. There's new things in there, but let's discuss the book in a minute because I think it is for an interesting audience, and the aim is to try and help a broad audience of people, not necessarily people who've worked in the field as long as I have, but a broader audience to come to this sense that there is positivity out there, there is hope, and we can indeed make an impact, because I think things can get a bit depressing sometimes. And as we discussed before we started recording, the world seems to be a strange place, getting stranger by the moment. But I feel that your book is a nice foundation and an anchor for helping people understand that they can take their own action. So let's get onto that. But before we do that, as I always like to learn about the personal life or the journey that you've taken to get to this place where here you are. How old are you, Tim?
I'm 52, so I'm Generation X. The name of the book is also a play on that this is the task of all the generations, whether you're a millennial or a boomer or Generation A or Z or X like me.
Indeed. So 52, and look, tell us about who you are, where you grew up, and also a wonderful theme that really resonated with me through the book was this wonderful connection to nature. Just tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so something I realized after I finished the book, and therefore it's not in the book, but I started my first ecosystem restoration projects when I think I was 9 years old in the garden of my grandparents, and where I grew up in northern Germany, a small village. There wasn't really that much to do other than spend a lot of time in nature, fishing, camping, hiking, went for long walks with my grandfather, was a forest engineer. And I took it upon myself to restore the pond in my grandparents' garden because I thought, it was very overgrown and there was not a lot of aquatic life, and there was eutrophied. The water was too many nutrients in the water. I didn't know at the time the term ecosystem restoration or, not much about ecology, but I started to listen to what I now know, listen to nature and look at what the animals and plants needed around that mini ecosystem, and build a rock structure for lizards and replace some of the water plants that they would produce more oxygen and cleanse the water, and took a lot of the toxic algae out. And what stuck with me since that early experience is how much nature responds to that kind of intentionality from humans, because we are ecosystem engineers. We're like beavers and elephants and earthworms. We are also ecosystem engineers. We're just so much more powerful than other ecosystem engineers, and we are not really aware of that responsibility and that power. We're using at the moment that power mostly for extraction of commodity value from nature, which is the smallest part of our responsibility and our power and our relationship with nature. So that's where it comes from my upbringing. And obviously, a lot of people nowadays live in cities and don't have the upbringing in the countryside. But I think even in cities, we feel that there's a yearning for reconnecting with nature. I see and hear that a lot, including from younger generations, that feeling that we are in a relationship crisis with nature and we need to fix it.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And how interesting about the pond. I have a pond in my childhood as well, probably around about the same age. I used to take my dogs to a pond, and I'd sit with the pond and look at all the tadpoles and frogs, and so yeah, powerful places in children's lives. Everyone needs a pond. I'll send you something about that separately, but yeah, everyone needs a pond. So after your experience there, what was your journey to the workforce? I know you worked in the UN. Just tell us a bit about that, mate. The reason I ask is we get a lot of young listeners to the podcast, and they're all, a lot of young people are inspired by what they hear and they want to move into this space, but they often they can't always see the path. So I like to hear the path from our guests, and it can inspire a lot of young people into this place.
Yeah, I think the main idea for the path to follow is to follow the interest and follow your heart if your heart's in it. And my heart was certainly in that passion for forests and for ecosystems. So after high school, I studied forest conservation and forest engineering, or got a master's degree in forestry in Germany, and then started my career as an urban forest research assistant. And one of the most interesting papers I read at that time was when you compare how long people spend in hospitals after severe injuries, people who look out on a green space or a park are released on average 2 days earlier than people who look out on a brick wall or have no window.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing how much we need nature and that idea of freedom and space and connection, even for basic things like our health. And after that, I moved on to a brief stint at the European Commission. I was an intern there, and then for the next 5 years was the regional program coordinator for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and helped set up our offices in Tbilisi and Belgrade. And this was, of course, in the early 2000s, where there was still a lot of change happening in those areas, and yet there were biodiversity hotspots, both the Caucasus and Southeastern Europe. So after 5 years with IUCN, I joined the United Nations and became the Forest Biodiversity Officer at the Convention on Biological Diversity at the CBD. And for the next few years, worked on fascinating things like the International Bushmeat Liaison, where we try to get a handle on illegal hunting in the tropics, and was part of the Nagoya and the Aichi targets setting. So that first 2010 target for biodiversity that now has been replaced by the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I stayed with the UN for 15 years altogether in various roles, including 10 years in Nairobi at the headquarters of UNEP, at the UN Environment Program, where I was heading the Nature for Climate team in the Ecosystems Division. So everything from this Article 5 of the Paris Agreement on forests' role in climate action to ecosystem-based adaptation and funding from Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund. And then in 2020, I helped a company that I admittedly had never heard of before then, but even though it's one of the 100 largest companies in the world. But Salesforce was the driving force behind starting the Trillion Trees initiative at the World Economic Forum. And they'd asked my advice on how to set this up and make this part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which I had established as part of my portfolio in UNEP, and which we're still in. We're halfway through this decade, by the way. So after helping Salesforce set up that initiative, and they made a commitment to restore and conserve 100 million trees, they kept coming to me for advice and said, how do you now do this? And where do you invest? Who do you work with? What is actually this thing called ecosystem restoration? How does it work? And after a bit of time doing that, they just said, why don't you come and work for us? Because we want to set up a nature team. We want to get involved in the task force on nature-related financial disclosure. We want to look at our water footprint. So yeah, I joined Salesforce in May 2022. And it's been a fascinating ride coming from 20 years in the public sector to one of the world's largest technology companies, where now, of course, things have accelerated even more with the race towards AI. So yeah, that's my pathway in a nutshell. But nature has always been the guiding principle, this connection we have with nature. And then I published the book alongside my work in Salesforce, and it was published in October
2025. And that summarizes some of the lessons over the years from my various parts in this professional journey.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And fascinating. And it's interesting, not so many people from my experience go from the UN into the private sector. It's sometimes it's the other way around, but those two beasts often don't have people that cross over that threshold. But I also think it's much needed because, companies, as you capture in the book, we might come back to this, don't always have the on-ground experience to make restoration projects work, for example. And they might have sustainability teams, but it's quite different to actually then getting, for example, trees in the ground and making successful projects. We'll come back to that later. You touch on that later in the book. Let's come to the book. It's, as I said in my introduction, I really enjoyed reading it. And just give us a sense now, who did you write it for, mate? Because, as you say, not for people like me who are neck deep in this stuff, but who's the audience for the book?
The audience is anybody who is interested or perhaps should be interested in ecological literacy. And to me, that is basically everybody alive today, because we need to pay more attention to ecology. This is the main message of the book. To repair our relationship crisis with Mother Nature, we need to understand ecology. And the book, I used to joke with my publicist a bit about this, because apparently in the publishing industry for nonfiction books, there's a stereotypical trade reader that they talk about, a person who buys a lot of nonfiction books and is not necessarily an expert, but very interested in a lot of new topics. And they call that person the well-read dentist. I don't know why it's a dentist, but so the book is written for an audience who's interested in learning new things that are essential for the future of having a functioning civilization. I think ecology is really at the basis of that understanding, how we can continue this fascinating experiment we call human civilization in a hopefully not continuously interrupted way. And in the book, I also look at the history of the past about 5,000 years of the ups and downs of ecology and ecological collapses in various civilizations and what we can learn from that. And we don't want to come to another boom and bust cycle of our ecological balance, because at the moment we simply cannot afford that. We are too many people. We are too dependent on nature. Nature is too fragile. We've hollowed out nature's capacity and resilience too much. We cannot afford a bust in our relationship with nature. We cannot afford to be in this relationship crisis with nature, or as the UN Secretary General calls it, our suicidal war with nature. This is what the situation is at present, and the book's about how we get out of that.
Yeah. Well, again, there's so much I could talk about in the book, and, the first chapter, really resonated with me very strongly, because you're talking about how rich nature was, and I, as a young guy growing up in rural Australia, I'd often go into forests and you see these pictures of these massive trees that used to be there, and they were all cut down and many of them sent to England for use in sometimes warships and all sorts of things. And you think, golly, imagine what was here. Imagine the ecology that was here. And you share quite a few stories there around, the ships having to part the turtles so they can get into the shores and things like this. And of course, it's quite different now. So that was I think it was a sobering wake up to the start.
I've actually had some people tell me that they almost stopped reading after chapter 1 because they found the chapter very hard to digest. But to anybody who's listening and is interested in the book, it does get more and more optimistic and upbeat and hopeful after that. But the first chapter is pretty drastic, because we have to start with a realistic look at what the situation is now. And you mentioned you're growing up in Australia. When I was a young teenager, we went fishing a lot in a lake near our village, and we were catching European eel, which at that time was a fairly abundant freshwater fish in Europe. And the population of eel has plummeted by over 90% within the last 30-some years. So within my lifetime, this population has completely crashed, which means that my children will not have that experience. And that makes me want to do something about it. We also have to acknowledge, though, that there's an issue here called shifting baseline syndrome. And that's also what I talk about in the first chapter.
Yes.
That this collective amnesia, that if you don't remember what this used to be like, you simply don't know. You think the state of nature that we see now is what it is. And we're so impoverished that we need to first remember how rich our natural heritage actually was and what we could get back to in terms of restoration, because most people simply don't know how much we've already lost and what we could regain.
Indeed, indeed. A great point. Let's encourage our listeners. Go beyond chapter 1. I did. I must say, it was sobering. Chapter 1 was sobering, but I knew a lot of those stories already. But if you're unfamiliar with those stories, you've got to work through it, because I think you've got to, you can't get out of a hole unless you know how deep it is, or where you're going to. And I think those stories help us understand that, nature is far more bountiful than what we're seeing, and that's the task ahead. See if we can get back to that place. So no, I thought it was very, very, very foundational and helpful chapter. And then the next one, and you do talk about the history of ecology and things like this, but I really enjoyed your discussion around, are we part of nature? And I'd love you just to, because I'm with you. I'm a great believer in the fact that we firmly are. And I think this separation has done us great disservice and done nature great disservice as well. So, and got us to where we are, this mess that we're in. So can you perhaps just share a little bit about that, mate?
Yeah, when you look up the term nature in the Oxford Dictionary, one of the definitions there is the phenomena of the physical world collectively, as opposed to humans and their culture. So the Oxford Dictionary tells us we are not only are we not part of nature, we are opposed to anything that is in the natural world.
Now, there's something I didn't know. There's something I didn't know, and I read that.
How bizarre is that? And of course, the indigenous peoples of the world know that it is absolutely not true, that we are, not only are we part of nature, nature is our family, nature is our home, nature is our balance. And remembering that we are part of nature is not actually very difficult, because I think there is something called the biophilia theory by E.O. Wilson, who's written about how our co-evolution with ecosystems, with species, with the nature all around us has hardwired a love for nature into humans. And I think that is true. I've yet to meet somebody who absolutely hates everything about nature. Those people are very rare. At least I don't know many of them. I think the vast majority of us knows that something is wrong. And when I dug in the book into why we are on this collective philosophical autopilot that seems to tell us nature is just a commodity that is there for our taking and nothing more, I came to the era of enlightenment, which, by the way, the philosophers of the Enlightenment called that era themselves the Enlightenment era. That's how convinced they were on the right path. And many good things came from the Enlightenment. There's of course positive things that came from it, but one of the really negative things that came from René Descartes and some of his contemporaries was this idea that only humans have the divine spark. We are the only thing that is made in God's image, and everything else is just an intricate machine without feelings, without thoughts, without just running purely on instincts. Animals have no soul. All of that was imprinted in us in that era of enlightenment. Whereas, of course, in Eastern philosophy in particular, and in most world religions, and since Pope Francis also, again, in the Catholic Church, we very clearly have this idea now that we are all part of the same creation, coming from the same creator. Or if you're not religious and you don't believe in a loving intelligence or intelligent love that coordinates things, then at least we are all made of the same stuff. And we're definitely related to other mammals, and to a surprising degree to some of them. So we are clearly part of nature, but we're also clearly different from all other animals. And that dichotomy gives us not the right to just burn and pillage. It gives us the responsibility to be stewards of creation. That is the key lesson and the shift that we need to make in our collective understanding of nature and our role in nature and for nature. And that, I think, shift from this autopilot that we're on, and that programs much of Western civilization and economy of the Enlightenment era, which, is now more than 300 years ago. So it's maybe time we reprogram that autopilot, because it's crashing us. It's crash landing civilization at the moment in this suicidal war with nature. So we must reprogram our understanding and rewrite, for example, the Oxford Dictionary's definition of nature.
That is quite extraordinary, isn't it? The Oxford Dictionary. But this is the thing about the book, I think. You correctly and wisely help set out where we stand. And we're not standing on very firm ground at the moment. But it is a hopeful and an inspiring, I was going to say second half, but I think it's more than the second half. It's maybe 2/3 of the book is really about, look, this is what we can do, and these are the things that are happening. And the book is rich with stories of actions that are being taken, some at a policy level, but also by individuals and by companies. And I have this sense that, I always often say to people, each of us can do what we can do. Maybe someone can do a bit more. They've got more means, but we can each do what we can do. And I think, that comes across very strongly in the book, particularly at the end, where you talk about your own farm that you've got. I believe it's in Denmark, right? Where you're actually sitting there saying, well, okay, this is a piece of land that I'm a steward of. What can I do here? Tell me a bit about that journey, mate.
Yeah, so we bought an old dairy farm here about 5 years ago, and are in the slow process of turning that into a permaculture and agroforestry farm. So we have a flock of sheep and do high pressure. So it's a short rotation, high intensity grazing scheme that we run to restore the biodiversity and the health of the soil. And when I say we, it's actually my wife who runs the farm. I mostly get to talk about it, but my day job doesn't let me spend a lot of time on the farm. But graciously, my wife has taken it on herself to restore our about 100 acres we have here, of 45 hectares. What we're learning in that experience is, again, this amazing speed at which nature bounces back and rebuilds that resilience. And we've seen that in a patch of forest that we planted 3 years ago that is already bursting with insect life, with flowers, with the trees that are coming back. We planted about 30,000 trees of various species. And it used to be an agriculture field, and maize mostly recently. So there was not really much going on in terms of soil biodiversity or any kind of wildlife, and how quickly nature recovers that space and creates this diversity and abundance, because already now that piece of land has a lot more soil carbon. It holds a lot more biomass below the soil, above the soil. It's frankly much more productive than it ever was as an agricultural field. It's just that in our agricultural system, we are not very good at capturing the value from those kinds of ecosystems. So the next forest we're planting, we're conceptualizing that more as a food forest with nut trees and fruits and a diversity of harvestable produce that we can then also build and generate a value stream from. It's a long-term endeavor, but it's fascinating to see how nature responds to those kinds of efforts. And obviously, not everybody has a farm that they can restore to health, but as I say in the book, it's really important that we all know where our food comes from. Food is not only the most direct interaction we have with nature 3 times a day, for most of us, it is also the most important sector. Agriculture is the most important sector for this transition away from an extractive relationship with nature to a regenerative one. And I have a huge respect for anybody who's a farmer who has, because it's an incredibly hard and complex job. And it's also the most important one currently for shifting this relationship that we have with nature. So we really need farmers around the world as our allies in this.
Yeah, we need to support them. And you mentioned this in the book about how seed funding and grant funding can help get things up and running, because there's a bit of a hump, right? We've got to get over that hump at the start, and then the economies and the farms can start running themselves. Forest protection is getting, tree planting, getting more investment, as you've said, and people coming to that now from an investment point of view, but it needs sometimes that help to get started. And some of the investors that I'm talking to are interested in funding forest conservation projects, that the return on their investment will not be financial. Their return on their investment in their mind is a legacy return, where they can basically say, here's a forest that's in trouble. We're looking at one in Cameroon, in fact, very rich with incredibly important species, but it's being eaten away by cocoa farmers and deforestation, illegal logging. And they're saying, well, what can we do to work with the local communities, with local NGOs, with the government? And if we could provide some seed funding there that would help that forest be protected, we'd go to bed easier at night, and we'd be able to look at our kids in the eye. So this question of return on investment is not always 20% on a monetary amount. It can be something where you say, well, as a result of my work, those species are still with us. I've stored this much carbon. You mentioned in the book the carbon markets, and this is some of the work that I'm doing with people around finding mechanisms by which they can get a return on their investment that sometimes is monetary, but doesn't always have to be. And look, I think maybe just if you could just give us, there's so many great examples in the book around people that are doing things. As you were speaking then about how quickly nature responds, I was thinking, you mentioned it in the book, farmer-managed natural regeneration, led by Tony Rinaldo, great friend of mine.
Yeah.
Great friend of mine, Tony. He's been on the podcast twice, and amazing how quickly these trees come back if they're just protected, right? So Tim, just give us there's so many cases in the book, but maybe I want people to come away from listening to our podcast with this sense of positivity. So maybe just give us a handful of cases that you've seen that are really starting to make you excited about this prospect of restoration.
Yeah, I would love to. And I just 2 months ago, I was in Brazil for the climate conference in the Amazon, and had a chance to visit one of those projects, which I find really, really fascinating. And what I find fascinating about this whole field is that when I started in this almost now 25 years ago, this was the realm of well-meaning NGOs, and there was a bit of grant funding doing this work, and there were pilot projects in a lot of places. What we're seeing now, and especially accelerating in the last few years, this is becoming a major industry. There is a nature restoration industry emerging, and I maybe don't really like the term industry because it does sound like it's another extractive mindset effort. But the nature restoration industry is growing at a very fast pace. And the project I visited in the Amazon is by a for-profit company called Momback. They are only 4 years old, but they're now running the largest native species reforestation project in the Amazon. They're working on 20,000 hectares. They are planting millions of trees. They work with around 100 native tree species. And what happens when you give the ecosystem there in the Amazon that little push is that nature really comes back in a very, very strong way. And they've included all their neighboring communities who benefit from the agroforestry produce that is coming back, from the ability to really draw on the ecosystem services more. All that land is currently degraded pasture land, because what happens in the Amazon and many tropical regions, as you also know from Africa, you take the forests away, you do slash and burn for a few years, the soil very quickly erodes because the topsoil is often surprisingly thin. And then the land is worthless for agricultural production, for a lot of the things we see as value, as financial value creation. So what I think, and in addition, the larger ecological processes like rainfall recycling, the evapotranspiration from trees that sends moisture back into the air, forms these flying rivers across the Amazon, that is disrupted. So even at a larger scale, this current way of degrading land is very disruptive. But there is a really fascinating ecosystem of ecopreneurs, people who are making it their life's mission and business to turn this around, especially in Brazil. There's a lot of companies, Momback, Regreen, Belterra, a few of them, that are increasing this ecosystem restoration to an unprecedented level. The government is now starting to give out large-scale restoration concessions, tens of thousands of hectares, both the federal and the state government. This is at the moment mostly driven by carbon credits and the sale of carbon credits, but there is, of course, also interest from the agro-food sector to stabilize their supply chains. So there are lots of examples like that from around the world. Also, some still by NGOs in the high Andes. Acción Andina is an effort that aims to restore all the high Andean, sort of above 4,000 meters, the high Andean cloud forests that are so important for capturing and storing water for the entire continent. And there's only about 10% of that forest left. And Acción Andina, again, only 5 years old, the initiative, but is now working in 400 locations. There's over 30,000 people involved, and they've surpassed 10 million trees last year, native trees, these polylepis, high cloud forest trees that they're restoring. So there are great things like that happening everywhere on regenerative agriculture. But I want to end on a note that you started with in terms of financial capital. My favorite framework for investing in large-scale restoration efforts like that is the 4 returns framework by a group called Common Land, where they say we have to look beyond financial return. It is one return that you can aim for, but you also have to aim for a return of natural capital, of social capital in terms of the benefits for local communities, and of inspirational capital, which is sort of my favorite addition of that capital that you can get from large-scale restoration. And to make this even more interesting as an investment or an asset class, as it's called in financial terms, we do have to do some reprogramming of our economy still. It's because there are positive outcomes of restoration that are useful for all of society: clean air, clean water, healthy soils, stable food production, resilience. If those things go bad, if we erode our soil, if we have a lot of nutrient runoff into rivers and the sea, all those damages that we caused, they are what is called negative externalities. They are produced by the agricultural sector, but they're paid for by you and me through our taxes, or through the loss of life quality, or through our health in some cases, when there's too much nitrate in drinking water, for example. So we have to rebalance that cost calculation so that we pay for and incentivize what improves our quality of life and our ecosystem, not what degrades it, and then separate out those costs. So there's a whole chapter. It doesn't get too technical, but there is a chapter on the economics of rebuilding natural capital and what needs to happen also from a policy perspective. And of course, one of the most important things that each of us can do is also be politically astute and active and interested in those topics in terms of what changes need to happen at a political level.
Absolutely agree. And that was one of the key points that came out of the book for me, is that despite all these optimisms and the stories, which are there, and let me say, and we might come back to this, but I think you've touched on something else that I want to unpick now. You also make it clear in the book that you've seen through first-hand experience where projects got off to a rocky start. It's not that everyone gets excited and suddenly trees are going in the ground and everything's successful. This is hard work, because these are often very degraded landscapes that are being planted into or intervened in. They're not always tree planting projects, and you've got to work with local communities. You mentioned a project in Madagascar that didn't go well, but then you regrouped, you came again. The NGO looked at its methods, talked to the communities, and now that project's coming back with great things. And so, I think long term, companies like Salesforce and others who are investing in this space need to understand that it's not a straight line, right? There will be failure. And if you just give up at the first hurdle, we ain't going to make it. And we've got to have resilience. We've got to fight in there. Maybe we can come back to that. But I want to come back to this question of policy, and you've raised that. It's very important. A lot of my work has been company to company, sitting between companies and NGOs, getting companies to sign on to no deforestation commitments and things like this. And a very wise fellow from an NGO called Earthsight, called Sam Lawson, many years ago, Sam convinced me that we need government policy. He said, look, it's all great that these companies are doing these things, but we've got to lift all boats because there's always going to be some laggards. And so government policies are important. And I agree with Sam on that. And I want to get him on the podcast to talk about his latest work. But I found myself as I was going through the book, you do mention a lot of positive policy developments, particularly in the EU. And I found myself scratching my head at this also. Not scratching my head that there's something wrong with it. I absolutely agree with it. But we live in strange times. And as we said, getting stranger by the day, it seems, that we do have this coming back, if you like, or this pushback against maybe left-leaning, centrist left governments. And we've got this very strong, I don't know what the word is, acceleration or coming back into power of right-wing governments or interest in right-wing governments. And we see the sort of policies that governments like the US government are coming up with, which seem to be going back to this 50s and 60s absolute extraction mindset. Make America great again means, opening up forests and reserves for mineral exploitation, for logging, all of these things. What's your sense of that, Tim? I mean, I think there is positive, but I've seen this myself, and I'm like, maybe we need those people to come back and sort of have a last gasp and maybe screw it up so royally that people look at it and say, we can't ever do that again. Maybe I'm being naively optimistic about this, but I think the counter is that we get very depressed and despairing when we see these governments coming in doing what are clearly, this idea that climate change is a hoax, for example, just does my head in. And right at the time when we need the most powerful country in the world to be putting its shoulder to the wheel for climate action, we see them going in the opposite direction. What's your sense of that? Is this something you think is just a phase? Do you feel optimistic that we're going to get through this and there'll still be some nature left? Or, where are you in that space?
Oh, there'll always be nature. I have no doubt about that. The question is more, what is the status of our civilization and the level of sophistication we can afford, which is directly dependent on the level of ecosystem services for food, water, stable climate. So this is about our quality of life rather than about nature's long-term survival. Obviously, I know the EU much better than the US. I think even in the United States, there's still a lot of positive things happening, especially on regenerative agriculture, on city and state level action. One thing I've learned in this work is where we put our attention, we also focus our energy. And of course, when you put your attention on the negative news and on all the things that are going wrong, this is also where you put your energy, and this is where your energy drains. So one thing I'd recommend to anybody, read pages 5 to 7 of your newspaper or your online news portal, because that's usually where the good news are hidden, right, not on the front page. Because we need to focus on the things we can do and that are working well. And one example I'll give is this political cliffhanger we had here in the EU over the last 2 years with the adoption of the EU Nature Restoration Law. The EU put into law last year the Nature Restoration Law that will require the EU to restore 20% of all land and seascapes by 2030 to good ecological condition, and then by 2050 to return all degraded lands to healthy landscapes. And that's aspirational. Nobody really knows how that's going to work, but it is a clear market and policy signal that this is the business opportunity now to come in and invest in regenerative agriculture. We're seeing a lot of investment funds that are now following through in making those kinds of investments in restoring soil biodiversity, in restoring healthy forest landscapes, in restoring ecosystem services. And that kind of policy progress is still happening in places around the world. And what this means for local initiatives, like even on our small farm here, is it makes it so much easier to do the local action and the community engagement when the policy environment is conducive, when there are what is called the enabling conditions for change on the ground, when they are right. Agricultural subsidies are by far the largest part of the EU budget. They're around half of the entire EU budget is about 50 billion euros per year or thereabouts is agricultural subsidies. How those are structured and programmed is hugely important for this entire sector. So continuing to make progress on that policy front and putting into practice now, what does it mean to restore that much of the EU? What does it mean to shift to a bioeconomy, which is the new term that's been coming out of the G20 discussions in the last few years? What does that mean for restructuring the way our economy works? And what does it mean for each one of us, how we can benefit from that kind of shift and turnaround in the economy? But of course, yeah, I also read the front page of the news, and those are not always very cheerful. And I think it's important to recognize that this is also going on, but there's an equal amount of good news. You just have to look harder for it.
Absolutely agree. A couple of last things I want to touch on, and this really comes back to this question of humans being part of nature. I've got it here, page 137. I think I wrote down the Natura 2000 initiative that you were involved in, and how you really looked at this whole question of seeing humans as part of the landscape. And for example, national parks are often considered these places where, okay, that's just nature, and we get all the people out. Particularly, this is very much the case that I've seen in Africa, Asia, yes, I guess in Latin America as well, but certainly in Africa, where large NGOs have come in and convinced governments just to lock all that, and then they've moved Indigenous people out of the land with huge consequences for the well-being of those people and for the environment, because the environment had evolved with those people being part of it. I didn't know about the Natura 2000 thing, and I was really taken by it because, at the same time, I've just come back from Nigeria, where I saw that the European deforestation regulation could have a huge impact, negative impact on the quality of life of smallholder farmers. And, I've been devoting my life to the conservation of forest, and I find myself in an interesting place where I'm like, okay, those farmers need a livelihood. If we exclude them from the European market and they decide they're going to sell their cocoa into markets that don't care about deforestation, we could probably see a lot more deforestation than if we had a system whereby we worked with the farmers in the way that you described with the Natura process, where you consider them part of the landscape as opposed to separate from it. And we say, look, we don't really want a lot of deforestation, but maybe we could discuss how much and what areas you move into. Please don't move into those important forests there because they're rich with important species, but what about these forests? And so a land use planning approach and an acceptance that people are there, they're already there, they've been there a long time, they're part of the landscape, they deserve a livelihood. And the sort of blunt instrument of a legal regulation that says you can't chop down a single tree, and if you do, you won't be selling any product to the European Union. I think it's going to have a lot of negative impact. So when I read that, what you were talking about there, I was like, wow, that's interesting, because I've seen so many cases where communities, smallholder farmers, Indigenous people have been removed from landscapes, and it's just a disaster. So maybe you can just share something about that, mate.
This was one of the hardest parts for me to wrap my head around when I looked into the conservation movement and found that this idea that humans are separate from nature is very widespread within the conservation movement. Because nature is deified in a way. Nature is some divine wilderness that is best left in peace, and we should just leave nature to its own. And that is as misleading as saying we are superior to nature. Nature is just here to serve as our extended warehouse. Both views are misleading. And of course, it's more difficult to change the mindset of conservationists almost, because it's an outcome of our overall philosophy that we are not part of nature, that we then gave rise to the idea that nature really only thrives in wilderness where humans are not present. Let me share the example of the Amazon rainforest or the Amazon basin, where our idea would be that's a really, really remote wilderness where there's maybe some indigenous peoples, there's some tribes in voluntary isolation that have not been contacted. But in reality, if you look back 2,000 years, there were probably more people living in the Amazon basin outside of the big cities like Manaus and Belém than there are today. Latest LiDAR mapping of the Amazon with laser mapping reveals archaeological structures in abundance. The Amazon forest was a garden more than a primary forest without much human intervention. So I think we have to reset our calibration of what nature is, because nature thrives usually best in places where humans and nature coexist in harmony. One of the initiatives I was part of while I worked for the CBD was the Satoyama initiative, part of the Japanese presidency's efforts to map landscapes around the world, which, like in the Japanese Satoyama, the village and the mountain coexisting in harmony, there are landscapes around the world where we can map where humans and nature both thrive. We thrive together as one entity in the right management and in the right structures. So I think that is the ideal we should strive for. We are part of nature, and there's a lot of data to support that the best managed and protected areas around the world are indigenous lands, indigenous managed territories. They're not national parks or protected areas or areas that are under other land use. They are indigenous managed lands that are under the stewardship of humans. And I think we have to get to that understanding that we are these ecosystem engineers. We have that responsibility. We have the knowledge, the power, the finance, the tools to be benign and useful ecosystem engineers rather than extractivist locusts, or as some conservationists like to say, we're a disease on the planet. This is not true, and it's also not helpful for either for the discussion or to get the word out to a wider population about how we should change our relationship with nature. We are part of nature, and in that sense, we also have to rewrite our concept of this idea of wilderness, which is basically non-existent and has never really existed in that sense of the Western romanticist view of nature.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely where I stand as well. I wanted to mention back in 1990, I was blessed to go to study in England, and I found this book by an American professor called Linton Keith Caldwell, and it was called Between Two Worlds: Science, the Environmental Movement and Policy Choice. And this was written in 1990. It was published around September 1990. I got it hot off the press. And it was one of those books that I would say changed my life and changed my perspective. There are not too many like that. But Professor Caldwell talked about a climacteric, a turning point, a moment of decision. And I was going to get it, and I will share it with you. I'll share it with the audience too. But he talked about humans have this capacity to make the decision to save ourselves, basically. He painted a bleak picture, even back then in 1990, of the tipping points that we were crossing, the thresholds we were crossing. Long before I think those things became, I think people talk about the 9 or 11 thresholds now. We've crossed 6 of them or whatever. A fascinating book. And at the end, he says, the fundamental question he raises is, we can change the way. We've plenty of evidence to show that we have been able to change away from destructive practices in the past. And the big question that he left us with was, will we have it within us to do it this time as we move into this really quite a crisis situation? That was 1990. I revisited it again in 2012 and wrote a bit of a blog about it. And I talked a lot about, the wisdom of elders and Indigenous people amongst them. They know how to do these things. So as I was coming to the end of your book, Generation Restoration, I found myself thinking of Caldwell. And what I took from your book was this sense that a lot of great things are happening. What I know from the front page of the papers, that there's a lot of not great things happening. And I find myself coming back to Caldwell's question of the 1990s, like, will we do it? Will we move away from our path to come into this generation restoration that you so beautifully capture in the book? I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that.
So one of the things that makes me very hopeful is just basically how life works. And one of the key principles of life is the dualism. Things are always in tension between night and day, between the seasons, between the danger that we face right now and the forces that can help us and come to our rescue. And we are always, in a way, perched on that decision point that you referred to, because part of human existence, and I believe part of the purpose of why we're here, is to make the right choices. And by learning and experiencing what it means to make the right choices, the choices for life, for collaboration, for being a better person, for being a better steward of nature. And I believe that we will always have that opportunity to make the right choice and always live, but also always live in that tension, that there's some stuff that's going on that we don't like. But that this principle that when there's danger, that which saves also grows at the same time and is kept in a balance, is something that is just how life seems to operate. That we are always in that tension where we are exactly asked to make the right choice, always. So this idea that every one of us is in this together and has choices to make is so important to my core thesis of the book of ecological literacy, because we make countless decisions every day that could either further see us slide down this path of apathy and extractivism and an abusive relationship with nature, or we could shift that into a more understanding, loving, caring relationship with nature that sees humanity as the stewards of nature and us as stewards of creation. What gave me a lot of hope is also reading Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. So it's published in 2015. It had a bit of a slow start, but now is really well recognized around the world as one of the most important philosophical recent publications around our relationship with nature and each other. Of course, it goes beyond the relationship with nature, but what Pope Francis said in the encyclical about us being part of nature could not be more clear and could not be more different from what centuries of Enlightenment era, but also, of course, a lot of religious doctrine over the past 2 millennia have led us to believe that we are above nature. He really very clearly adjusts that picture. And I think for the 1 billion Catholics in the world, that's of course an important read, but I think it's also a very good read for anybody who's not a Catholic.
Completely agree. Beautiful text and very powerful. Tim, I think we're coming to the end of our time. I had one more question, but I feel that we could go off and talk about it for a whole new podcast. But it came to me as I got towards the end of your book, and you've touched on it here without specifically naming it, and there's this question of spirituality. And my sense, I'm a great believer that if you look at our modern society, at least our Western society, the physical and the intellectual are very strongly prioritised. What we do and what we think. The smartest person in the room gets the highest salary, gets the promotion, all this sort of stuff. And the doing, the person who can do X, Y, Z the most efficiently and the best, they get the profits, they get the business. And I think that leads us to this extractive mindset. We have to do and think and be clever and, get the resources for ourselves. Emotional is sort of coming in a little bit, but it's also frowned upon, this idea, particularly for men, I think, if you're going to show emotion, it's looked upon very dimly. But this question of vulnerability is coming into the discourse now. Purpose, you mentioned purpose earlier. But this idea of spirituality is like so far pushed away. And I always talk to people about 4 gardens, the physical, the mental, the emotional and the spiritual. And I think we've pushed the spiritual away so much, and we confuse sometimes this question of spirituality and religion. It can be the same, but it's not always. There's a lot of people who aren't religious who spend time walking in forests. I'm one of them. Or sitting on the beach looking out to sea and having spiritual renewal through that process. I sensed in reading your book a deep spiritual connection to nature, and I did want to explore that. And I wonder, we've got a few more minutes, I think, and I think our listeners would be fascinated to hear about where your beliefs in that. If you can share something about that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, you're right that this was a big part of my motivation for writing the book, was this inner journey and the inner quest of exploring what it means to be human. What is our purpose in life? Which I think is a question that most people ask themselves, even if they're not spiritual. But where that question leads ultimately is towards that inner search for truth, and whatever that truth is that people seek. I wouldn't call myself a religious person. Religion as in organized spirituality, but I do believe I am a spiritual person, and I meditate every morning, at least as much as I can. And the link that we feel with the rest of creation is not only felt by us; it's also felt by the rest of creation. We are divinely inspired beings. I do believe that. And, I'm not asking any readers in the book to believe that. The book is written more from a secular perspective. But when you have that belief, it also becomes clear that this is a two-way street. There's a two-way communication that happens with the rest of creation, with the animals that we share our farm here, our landscape with, for example, with the wildlife. There is a reciprocity that we have to come back to that can be explained in a spiritual way, but that can also be explained in a very rational way. The reciprocity we have to get back to with nature is what sustains any collaborative activity in life. You need reciprocity in societies, in communities, in families, and getting away from the abusive relationship we have with nature to one that is based on reciprocity is, for me, motivated by a spiritual journey, but it also, of course, makes a lot of sense in terms of the resilience, the economic dependence we have on nature, the many ecosystem services we depend upon. I find it just more accessible if it also has, as you say, this fourth garden, the spiritual element to it, because listening to nature and observing nature and becoming quiet and still and looking within is difficult in our hectic life and in our very high-paced environment. And but it is so rewarding to see how nature responds to that intentionality. When you have that mindset and you move in nature, you are with nature, you have that mindset in what you do, how you eat your food, how you source your food. It is a very, very rewarding experience, and one that I can only recommend to anybody reading the book as part of diving deeper into ecological literacy.
100% agree. Tim, fantastic to speak to you today. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, and I'm sure our listeners are going to enjoy that. And please, everybody, do get a copy of Tim's book, Tim Christophersen, Generation Restoration, How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. Thanks so much for writing the book, Tim. Thanks for joining us, mate. And look, best of luck with your ongoing work. We haven't talked about what you're going to do in the future, but I think we maybe catch up again and talk about that another time. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Scott. It was a pleasure.
Wonderful.